All right, today we are going to go over antebellum culture and reform, and we're going to focus upon the idea of the romantic impulse. And this doesn't mean romance as in love. This was a movement that came over from Europe in the early part of the 19th century, the 1800s from Europe. And it was this idea that kind of ran against the Enlightenment rationalism of the end of the 18th century. And so besides the word romantic impulse up there, let's also take a look at that first word, antebellum. Antebellum, if you hear that term, if I say that term in passing, it really means kind of, at least for us, the word itself has a slightly different meaning, but for us here in the United States, it means the time before the Civil War, and so kind of like the time before the chaos. And so we're really talking about here probably mostly the time between the 1820s and 1850s. Okay, let us begin. All right, so following the War of 1812, remember that we had a political growth of nationalism, this idea of what really amounts to patriotism, this love of our country, this idea of, hey, America is great. And we talked about that in terms of era good feelings. But we also see it in American culture as well. And so we start to see, for the first time, really, us breaking away from the traditions of Great Britain and maybe France to a lesser extent, but really of Great Britain. At the time in the early 1800s, a lot of the intellectuals still look to Europe for inspiration. We still look to Europe for artistic styles, for fashion styles. And, probably when the War of 1812 is over, we really start to see America's culture start to flourish for the first time. And we start to see people that are inspired by America's scenes and not by Europe, what's going on in Europe. Okay, so a couple of good examples. First, we start with Noah Webster. And Webster was probably one of the key people that wanted to create an American dictionary that was different than the words of England, and wanted to make it a distinctive style of American English as to opposed to obviously British English or English English. So you're talking about things like the word color. So in Britain, it would be COLOUR, and Webster started spelling it COLOR. So these are just little things here and there. Obviously, we're starting to be far enough apart from the British that our slang is getting different. Our language is starting to change a little bit from theirs. And so this kind of creates a distinction between the two languages. Now, early American literature, there's probably two people that you need to know. Washington Irving. You've probably heard of Washington Irving with the story of Rip Van Winkle or the Legend of Sleepy Hollow. And then James Fenimore Cooper, the Leatherstocking Tales. I think probably the best one there is Last of the Mohicans. But I think what's important is that these stories were centered, their actual story was centered in America and not in some European place, not in Britain. And what we're going to see with this idea of romanticism is the spiritual connection a lot of times to nature. And so, as you can see in these pictures, the stories are set in so like The Last of the Mohicans is set in the wilderness, and Legend of Sleepy Hollows in the forest and stuff like this. So you get this romantic sense kind of building in the early part of the 1800s. All right, we also get an appearance of a distinct American art form, and probably the group also centered in the New York area, just like the Knickerbocker group was, and that's the Hudson River School. And it wasn't an actual institution or school. I think we could probably more accurately call them the Hudson River Group. This is just a group of artists that just happened to be around the Hudson River Valley in the area of New York. And they all had kind of similar styles, probably the one that we know the best is Albert Bierstadt, if you've ever heard of Mount Bierstadt. He actually came out and started painting some of the major peaks of the West. We actually named one of our peaks after him. He's famous for painting, Yosemite and Yellowstone scenes. And but I think the key thing you want to remember with the Hudson River School, and again, I think largely influenced by this idea of romanticism, is you'll notice the focus on nature and the freedom that nature offers. It's kind of almost like a rejection against this industrial revolution that's going on at the time, where cities are sprouting up and crime and a certain amount of poverty and immigration and all of this stuff that's causing trouble in cities. And so here you can see the innocence and the purity of nature, and that's a big part of romantic thought. Okay, so we've talked about it, but let's kind of go into more depth with this idea of romanticism. And so romanticism really is a rejection of the Enlightenment rationalism, the so to speak, the scientific rationalism and reason. And it's it's kind of getting beyond that. The people of romantic thought that this kind of thought limited your ability to kind of transcend and to go beyond the limits of everything from gravity to government or whatever the case may be, and offered an alternative so that you could go beyond that. Okay, it also there is a sort of religious aspect of this that we'll talk about, and there's certain parts of romanticism that have nothing to do with religion, and then when we talk about like the Second Great Awakening, then there are some aspects of romanticism in there as well. But to some degree, we're going to see when we get to the Second Great Awakening that it's very an emotional movement. It's a very individual movement. It's a very positive movement. It's something that is open to the individual instead of the old, cold, austere beliefs of Congregationalist Calvinism, of predoctrination, of only there's a select few and the rest of you are damned, and you have no idea if you're going to heaven or not. And so kind of a rejection of those bleak ideas. It's also a reaction against, and I kind of mentioned this before, the rapid changes that are happening in the first part of the 1800s, brought upon by industrialization, the growing of cities, the growing of things like crime and people being mistreated in factories. And, we're talking about over a 50-year period of time that things are pretty rapidly changing socially and technologically. And, we kind of think about in terms of, social movements today and COVID and how those are related to each other and how they kind of affect one another. And so we must understand that the Industrial Revolution in America causes all these different reactions and changes. And romanticism in America is kind of one of those. It's, hey, look, here's this city and look how dirty it is and look at the pollution. And if we want to simplify life, let's go back into nature. Let's like this guy is looking out to the purity of natural landscapes instead of the evil of the city. All right, romanticism is also a belief that the human spirit is morally good, and this kind of plays back to the rejection of the beliefs of traditional religion, where Calvinists believe that humans are naturally depraved and that they are naturally evil, and you have to do whatever you can to show that you're not, and God selects only a few. And romanticism is a lot more positive than that. Romanticism believes the human spirit is actually good and can choose to do good. All right, and then a big part of romanticism is the belief in the spiritual and the emotional. And I think we'll see this best when we get to the Second Great Awakening. And the primacy of the individual, the inner self. Some of these people were, especially like the people of the Second Great Awakening, were inspired by people like the Quakers, where they had this inner light, this individual belief, and there could be a better world and a better person. And so it was kind of promoting the best inner self, whatever your truth was. And finally, we kind of talked about this with the painting, with the literature, and that is this deep spiritual connection with nature. A lot of these people that were romantics, they were educated, especially the intellectuals of the East that participated in this. They had read a lot of works by people across the world. Some of them had read about um, Buddhism and Taoism and things like that. And there's this kind of spiritual connection with nature. Okay, so in America, we don't typically call it romanticism or the romantic movement. In America, we typically call it transcendentalism. And so, just know that transcendentalism is really, in the European form of it, is romanticism, but in its American form, it's called transcendentalism. And it's really the belief that human emotion and spiritualism can overcome the limits of ration and reason. You can transcend, you can go beyond those limits and find kind of an inner truth. And so you can kind of see all of the things that transcendentalism is against. It rejects logic and science and authority and tradition, and so it's all about kind of breaking those barriers and rejecting those limits and things like that. And so you need to know transcendentalism's two main contributors. And unlike the Hudson River School, the Knickerbocker group that were centered in New York, you need to know that transcendentalism's main core of innovators was in the New England area around what we would call today Boston. And probably the godfather, so to speak, of transcendentalism was Ralph Waldo Emerson. You can see on the bottom right-hand corner, he was a mesmerizing speaker, a very charismatic man. And so probably he is kind of the leader of the transcendentalist movement. Now, one of his greatest disciples was a guy named Henry David Thoreau. And Thoreau writes two particular works that are of note. One is Walden Pond, which again is kind of a reaction against the things going on by industrialization. Thoreau, he went out, and this was actually on the property of Emerson. He goes out on the property and lives in a cabin for a year and writes about his experiences, about how he just kind of simplifies life. He gets in connection with nature and rejects a lot of those things that are happening during the Industrial Revolution of change, of the cities and things like that. His other greatly known work is Civil Disobedience, in which he rejects authority. Authority for the sake of just being authority. His idea was, if authority was wrong, for example, if our government makes a law and that law in some way injures another one, so like a poll tax, if a poll tax discriminates against a group, then there's nothing wrong with defying that law, and he would encourage you to do so peacefully. And so, and he spent many times in jail as a result of this nonviolent protest. Now, this is important because we're going to see that transcendentalism is going to have impacts in other places in American society. And, whether it's in support of transcendentalism or, as we're going to see in a minute, kind of anti-transcendentalism, it really kind of creates the development and the basis of a unique American literary tradition. Later on, we're going to see that it is, the abolitionists used the ideas of civil disobedience to fight slavery. And then when we get to, probably in world history, you learned about Gandhi. Certainly when we get to the 1950s and 60s, then we're going to learn about Martin Luther King Jr., who, promoted the ideas of Thoreau and civil disobedience. Okay, so on your key terms, you will see these people labeled as almost like the anti-transcendentalists. So the transcendentalists, they were very, a lot of times very positive, promotion of self. The human is good. The human has morality. Well, these people are kind of They're uniquely American, and that's one thing. The 1850s in particular had an amazing outpouring of what we would call literary giants. And, they were definitely influenced to some degree by the transcendentalists, but then kind of took their own flavor. And we kind of see with the anti-transcendentalists kind of a darker view of the human spirit. And so all of these books, to some degree, they sort of see that humans are immoral, that there's kind of a dark side, that humans are kind of bad. But nonetheless, these people contributed works that are uniquely American, and for the first time in American history, works that Europeans started reading. And so make sure that you kind of know them. I don't think you need to know too much about each one of these works. This is an English class, but just be able to kind of match them up as you see them there. The one probably my favorite is Moby Dick. I just think that it's a great story because it's kind of um, it's a two-layered book. And what I mean by that is, on one level, the book appeals to the ocean going people, the sailors. It's a good story about boat life because Herman Melville actually lived out on the high seas for several years before he came back to America. But then the intellectuals, they really appreciate Moby Dick for the tragic figure of Ahab and his quest to get revenge on the whale that had taken his leg, and in doing so, he ends up killing pretty much everybody else, destroying everything, and really including kind of himself, in able to get revenge on this whale that had hurt him. All right, now we kind of switch gears and we talk about the religious aspect to Romanticism. Remember that, especially in the New England area and then the people that sort of move west out to the frontier in the northern part, people are still largely influenced at this time by the rigidity and the morality and the authoritarianism of the Congregational Church, and that is to say, the what is left of the Puritan ideology. And remember that that's not a very inclusive kind of idea, because a lot of people were left out. You remember that the ideas of predestination included very few people as the elect, and so a lot of people were disillusioned by being excluded. And a lot of these people were on the frontier. Right. And so between Romanticism, the idea of Romanticism, and waning piety out on the frontier, it really gave way to a religious revival, similar in a lot of ways to the First Great Awakening 100 years earlier, that was centered also on the frontier, but different in its own way as it was affected by Romanticism. Okay, so the causes. So obviously, as we just said, this is waning piety. This is a reaction against the secular, and secular means non-religious. So a lot of people in the frontier, they see a lot of the people around them as not being religious enough, and so this is a way to kind of revive the morality of America. That had been kind of lost because of the secularness of the Enlightenment thought and ideals. Okay, we also talked about in terms of the changes brought about by industrialization. One of the things that the people of the Second Great Awakening objected to the most about industrialism was that as people gained more wealth, they wanted to buy more things, and they became kind of materialistic. And so that was one of the major currents of the Second Great Awakening. Remember that on the frontier, a lot of these people are very isolated. Roads, canals, internal improvements are getting better, at least to where ministers can travel a little bit easier. But still, people are, they're living on farms for the most part in the frontier. They're very isolated. And these camp meetings, these camp revivals we're going to talk about, that happen a lot of times late in the summer after the summer harvest. It was a good way for these people to socialize and to get together. And then, of course, we don't want to forget Jacksonian democracy. This is the Second Great Awakening is a movement by the common person, whereas we see transcendentalism as more kind of an intellectual movement. We see that more, kind of on the East. The Second Great Awakening is for the common person. It's for, I don't want to say, the uneducated, but the relatively uneducated. And you don't have to be this elect group. It's salvation for all. It's freedom of the individual. And so in that way, it was very democratic in a time where democracy is increasing. All right, so major events, the Great Revival. The center of the movement, remember, was the frontier with the less educated. Women, because the cult of domesticity, which we'll talk about more next time, women felt like they were pressured into this domestic role, and they were very isolated. This offered them a social outlet and a way to get out and be around other people and be around other girls and share and commiserate with their domestic roles. And so they found the Second Great Awakening found quite a following with young women. Right, the major groups that were involved in the Great Revival, as it was sometimes called, the Second Great Awakening: the Presbyterians, mostly in the Northwest, the Baptists in the South, and then the Methodists kind of somewhere in the middle of those. And so those were probably the three main groups. The Presbyterians did kind of line up a little bit with people in New England. That's how the Second Great Awakening was able to move back to the East a little bit. And the type of the Congregationalists we're talking about would be more the liberal ones, more of them that were more accepting to, salvation for all instead of salvation for the elect. So Presbyterians and liberal Congregationalists in the North and the Northwest and the Northeast. All right. So at these meetings, I want you to look down at the picture kind of in the bottom right there. And you see one of these camp meetings, and you can see a variety of things going on there if you really take a look. You can see, like one lady with her arms open wide. You can see people fainting. People got really emotional sometimes. People would shake and quake, and there were reports even, that people would start barking and all sorts of crazy things where they got just charged up really emotionally. And these areas across the frontier would the emotion and energy just spread like a wildfire. And so especially places like Western New York that were affected the most by this were called the burned over district. And the message was very positive in terms of every individual has a relationship with God, and salvation is based on free will. If you choose to do the right things and you choose to do what the Bible tells you to do, then you can achieve salvation. And so again, like we said, it's very democratic in that sense. Probably the most prominent figure that comes out of the Second Great Awakening, because he is just absolutely charismatic. And so, when you get to the end of the year, you probably want to study the difference between the First Great Awakening and Second Great Awakening, and make sure you don't want to get, mixed up with somebody like Jonathan Edwards or George Whitefield in terms of the First Great Awakening. But the key figure in the Second Great Awakening is Charles Grandison Finian. He's mesmerizing. He is a very charismatic, great speaker, would have people just absolutely in wonderment of his speaking abilities. And, he really had kind of a reforming message. He saw the problems in cities and taverns as these places where people, instead of going home to their families after a hard day's work in the factory, they were going and getting drunk and spending what money they had in taverns. And so, he spoke out against the abuse of alcohol. He was one of the prominent figures early on in terms of what we would early call the abolition movement, but against the horrors of slavery. And then he was also for women's rights. In fact, he helped to start one of the first women's colleges, Oberlin College. And so he was a really dominant figure during the Second Great Awakening. Okay, so if we kind of take a look at this, we see this division within society during the Second Great Awakening. Here you have uh, like these people in the Second Great Awakening, where the church and it should be LED. Sorry, there's a typo there. Church can be led by anyone who feels the Spirit, whereas back east, the church has to be led by somebody that graduated from Harvard or one of those prestigious Eastern schools that's trained and ordained in theology, a Puritan leader or something like that. Back out to kind of the West, it's very emotional, very charged up, where in the old established, it's very austere and intellectual and very cold, very human damnation kind of sermons. Remember that the Second Great Awakening at least starts in the West. It kind of works its way back to the East, but is largely a movement of the frontier. And then the old, kind of the old established churches are back in the East. The Second Great Awakening is more of a movement of the common person, whereas that old established order, and really you could say kind of that transcendental kind of movement, was led by the intellectuals and the wealthy. The Second Great Awakening, Methodists, Baptists, Presbyterians, and then I put slavery on the bottom because not everybody in the Second Great Awakening was necessarily like Charles Grandison Finney. But what we're going to see is that the Second Great Awakening is going to have a pretty big impact on people that want to get rid of slavery and people that start pressing their states and their areas to get rid of slavery. And this is going to cause more division within society. Okay, we're going to end up the Second Great Awakening by talking about the birth and growth of Mormonism, because this comes out of the burned, the burned over district in Western New York. And it starts really with a young man by the name of Joseph Smith. And the story goes that when Joseph Smith was pretty young, we're talking 14 years old, he was in the woods nearby. And on two separate occasions, he had events where one, he saw God, one, he was visited by an angel of God. And during that time, he had revealed to him the Book of Mormon on some golden tablets. And that kind of gave rise to his beliefs. And, part of that was that he was encouraged that all other types of Christianity were false, and that he was responsible for kind of creating this new kingdom of God on earth. And, he saw it as his duty to do that. And so, probably about 10 years go by, and now Joseph Smith is in his early 20s, and he's a very intelligent kid. He's very charismatic, and he starts to gather quite a following. And, one of the things that is in contradiction to what's going on at this time is this idea in America of this rugged individuality. And what we find with the Mormons, and they've always had this, and they still exhibit this today, is this tremendous sense of community, of not seeing each other as individuals, but as a group. And, that ran into contradiction with some of the things. The Mormons were very rigid on one another. And if you didn't do things exactly the way that they did it, well, then, you probably would not fit in with that group. And so outsiders didn't agree with this all the time. They didn't like some of the practices here and there. There were rumors that Joseph Smith was into polygamy, and that ran in contradiction to other religious groups' ideas of monogamy. And so for a variety of reasons, it seems like everywhere that Joseph Smith and his followers went, they kind of became outcasts, and they sort of, built up, so to speak, a fence around them to protect themselves. They started creating a military, and by the time that they worked their way to Nauvoo in Illinois, they had a militia of basically 5,000 people strong, and the people in that area felt very threatened by that. And so at one point, Smith and his people are attacked. Smith and his brother are taken captive, and eventually they are shot and killed. And at this point, it looks like Mormonism could fall apart, but in steps to the vacuum a man by the name of Brigham Young, who probably was, just as captivating, just as intelligent, very determined, very pretty much an organizational genius, and was able to hold the Mormons together after Smith's death. after Smith's death and organize a movement out to the West. And so to get rid or to get free from the persecution that they were facing in America, Brigham Young organized a caravan that would take the followers of Mormonism out to the West. And so you can see on our map down there that takes us out to the area that we would call today Salt Lake City. And at the time they called it Deseret. They believed that they were taking an area that you can see in the shaded kind of greenish color. Now, eventually, the United States will catch up with this. At the time that Brigham Young moved the Mormons out to Deseret, this is still part of Mexico and outside of the United States jurisdiction and territory. But soon, the United States will steal this area from Mexico in the Mexican-American War, and eventually will bring this area under the control of the United States government. But nonetheless, the Mormons kind of succeeded in creating a home base for their religion, and one that's still centered around Salt Lake City and obviously other cities like Provo. But they succeeded in creating this area for their group. Okay, that kind of ends our talk on and lecture on Romanticism, Transcendentalism, and the Second Great Awakening.